On January 21st, 2026, two men met for the first time in a hallway in Dallas, Texas. One was the son of a man executed by the state of Texas in 1956. The other was the son of the woman that man was executed for killing. They embraced. Then they walked into a courtroom together to ask the county to finally say out loud what both of their families had quietly believed for 70 years, that the wrong man had been put to death. This is the story of how that happened and why it took 70 years. To understand what happened to Tommy Lee Walker, you have to understand the city he lived in. In 1953, Dallas, Texas, was a city living under strict racial segregation, and that summer, it was gripped by a very specific kind of fear. Newspapers and police reports referred to rumors of a Negro prowler, an unidentified black man supposedly stalking white women across the city. The rumor spread fast. The fear spread faster. On the evening of September 30th, 1953, a 31-year-old store clerk named Venice Parker was walking home from work. She was attacked. Her throat was cut. She died from her injuries. It was by any measure a horrific crime. And in a city already primed by months of racial panic, the pressure to find someone, anyone, was immediate and overwhelming. A police officer would later claim that Venice Parker, before she died, identified her attacker to him as a Negro. Multiple witnesses who were present disputed this. According to later investigation, witnesses said Parker did nothing but convulse and bleed after the attack. She never spoke at all. That single, disputed claim, a dying word that other witnesses say was never said, became the foundation for everything that followed. In the months after the murder, Dallas police rounded up dozens of black men with no connection whatsoever to the crime. It was a dragnet built on fear, not evidence. 4 months later, in January 1954, they arrested a 19-year-old named Tommy Lee Walker. He wasn't picked up because anyone had identified him. He was picked up because police were told he might have information about an unrelated, non-violent matter. He became a suspect in a murder simply because he was in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in a city that was looking for someone who looked like him. Tommy Lee Walker had an alibi. On the night Venice Parker was killed, he was with his girlfriend, Mary Louise Smith, who was 9 months pregnant at the time. That alibi did not save him. What put him on death row was a confession, and the manner in which that confession was obtained is now, 70 years later, one of the central reasons Dallas County has acknowledged his innocence. The Dallas County Commissioner's Court's own resolution, passed unanimously in January 2026, describes what happened to Walker in stark terms. It states that his, quote, arrest, interrogation, prosecution, and conviction were fundamentally compromised by false or unreliable evidence, coercive interrogation tactics, and racial bias. Coercive interrogation tactics. That phrase carries a lot of weight. In practice, it means a 19-year-old black man alone in a segregated city, in a police station, under conditions that have never been fully detailed, but that the system itself now admits should never have produced a confession anyone could trust. That coerced confession became the only meaningful evidence connecting Tommy Lee Walker to the murder of Venice Parker. There was no physical evidence, no reliable eyewitness identification, just a confession extracted under conditions a Texas county would, 7 decades later, formally repudiate. And standing at the center of the prosecution that turned that confession into a death sentence was a young assistant district attorney, only 3 years into what would become an infamous 37-year career. His name was Henry Wade. If the name Henry Wade sounds familiar, it might be because you've heard it before, in a very different context. Henry Wade is the same Dallas County District Attorney whose name appears in the landmark Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade. He held the DA's office for 37 years and became one of the most powerful prosecutors in American history. Tommy Lee Walker's trial happened early in that career, and according to records uncovered decades later, it set a pattern Wade would repeat for years. An internal memo revealed long after Walker's execution showed that Wade instructed his prosecutors to systematically strike, in his own words, Jews, Negroes, Dagos, Mexicans, or a member of any minority race from juries. Tommy Lee Walker was tried and convicted by an all-white jury. That was not an accident. It was policy. But the misconduct in Walker's case went further than jury selection. Investigators reviewing the case decades later found that prosecutors withheld evidence favorable to Walker's defense, evidence that might have changed the outcome of the trial entirely. And then there's the detail that, even by the standards of 1950s Texas justice, stands out as extraordinary. During the trial, the prosecutor didn't just argue for Walker's guilt from behind the lectern. He took the witness stand himself, on rebuttal, and testified to the jury about his own personal belief that Tommy Lee Walker was guilty. Outside the courtroom, he reportedly said he wanted to personally pull the switch on Walker, a reference to the electric chair. This was not a fair trial. According to the data now compiled by the National Registry of Exonerations, Tommy Lee Walker is at least the 35th person convicted by Henry Wade's office to be exonerated. Among the others, Randall Dale Adams, whose case became the subject of the landmark documentary The Thin Blue Line, a man who came within 3 days of execution before he was cleared in 1989. Tommy Lee Walker did not get 3 days. He did not get a documentary. He did not get a stay of execution. He was 19 years old when he was arrested. He was sentenced to death. And on May 24th, 1956, at the age of 21, Tommy Lee Walker was executed in the electric chair. Tommy Lee Walker's execution did not pass unnoticed in the community that watched it happen. Marion Butts, publisher of the black newspaper The Dallas Express, wrote at the time that, quote, "Walker is dead, but he will forever live in the minds and conscience of those who have the ability to reason." That sentence sat in print for 70 years before the rest of Dallas caught up to it. For decades, the case went quiet. Not because doubt disappeared, but because there was no formal mechanism for the system to revisit it. Tommy Lee Walker was already dead. The legal avenues available to the living are rarely available to the deceased. That changed because of one journalist who refused to let the case stay closed. In 2016, journalist Mary Mapes reopened the case through her reporting, examining the original trial, the confession, the jury selection, and the conduct of Henry Wade's office. Her work reignited a question that had simmered quietly in Dallas's black community for 60 years. What if Tommy Lee Walker really was innocent? That question eventually reached the Dallas County District Attorney's office itself, the very office that had once sought his execution. What followed was not a quick correction. It was a methodical, decade-long investigation, one that became the oldest case ever assigned to the Dallas County DA's Conviction Integrity Unit. The current Dallas County District Attorney, John Creuzot, worked alongside the Innocence Project of New York and Northeastern University School of Law's Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, led by law professor Margaret Burnham, to comprehensively re-examine every piece of the case against Tommy Lee Walker. They re-examined the police officer's claim that Venice Parker identified her attacker before she died, and found it directly contradicted by other witnesses on the scene. They re-examined the confession and the conditions under which it was obtained. They re-examined the jury selection records and Henry Wade's own internal instructions to his staff. District Attorney Crusoe would later tell Dallas County Commissioners something remarkable, that his office today would never have pursued a criminal case against Tommy Lee Walker on the evidence that existed in 1954. That is not a small statement. That is the modern custodian of the very office that built this case, looking back at his own institution's history and saying, "We got this wrong." On January 21st, 2026, the Dallas County Commissioners Court convened to vote on a resolution. It was, according to the Innocence Project, the first posthumous proclamation of innocence ever issued by a commissioner's court in the state of Texas. The resolution stated plainly that Tommy Lee Walker's, quote, arrest, interrogation, prosecution, and conviction were fundamentally compromised by false or unreliable evidence, coercive interrogation tactics, and racial bias, and that what happened to him represented, in the county's own words, a profound miscarriage of justice. It went further. The resolution declared, justice has no statute of limitations, and when injustice is discovered, it should be recognized and acknowledged. The vote was unanimous. In the room that day was Ted Smith, Tommy Lee Walker's son. He had carried his father's case and his father's name for his entire life. He later told a local news station something that captures, more than any legal document could, what this exoneration actually meant. I have been tricked out of my life. I am innocent. That is the last thing my mother told me. Also in the room was Joseph Parker, the son of Venice Parker. The woman Walker was executed for killing. He embraced Ted Smith before the vote. He told the commissioners that he hoped this case would help prevent future wrongful convictions, saying the mistake being the injustice, the taking of an innocent life. 2 sons, 2 families, both harmed. One by a murder that was never properly solved, the other by an execution that should never have happened. 70 years later, in the same building, they finally stood on the same side of the truth. Tommy Lee Walker cannot be brought back. No resolution, however unanimous, however carefully worded, can undo what the state of Texas did to a 21-year-old man in May of 1956. What this case can do, what it's meant to do, is stand as a record that says this happened, that it was wrong, and that the system that did it has, 70 years later, finally been forced to say so out loud. Justice, the resolution said, has no statute of limitations. The question this case leaves behind is simpler and harder than any legal document can answer. How many more Tommy Lee Walkers are still waiting for someone to ask the question that took 70 years to ask about him? Tommy Lee Walker waited 70 years for the truth to matter. If this story moved you, subscribe. Every week, we bring you another case the system tried to forget.